Imagine stepping into a royal palace. The marble floors gleam, the golden chandeliers drip light like honey, the velvet curtains sway with elegance. It looks perfect until your nose betrays you, because it doesn't smell like roses, or incense, or even the faint musk of burning candles. No, the air itself seems poisoned. The stench is so strong it feels alive, slithering into your nostrils, crawling down your throat, making you gag before you even reach the throne. For centuries, kings and queens, those glittering symbols of wealth and power, lived in such filth that their bodies reeked worse than the corpses rotting on their battlefields. These weren't peasants trudging through mud. These were monarchs dripping with jewels, drowning in silk, and oozing with stench. Hygiene wasn't just ignored, it was a cosmic joke. Perfume bottles were sprayed like fire extinguishers, dousing sweat, rot, and pus. Chamber pots overflowed behind silk screens, and the sacred corpses resting in nearby cathedrals often smelled fresher than the monarchs ruling above them. Tonight, we're peeling back the polished portraits and powdered wigs to count down 7 royals whose odor could empty a banquet hall faster than a plague rat in the soup. Rotten teeth, rancid sweat, perfumed decay. If you thought royal life smelled sweet, you're about to choke on the truth. King James I, the garlic breath, monarch. King James I may have ruled over England and Scotland, but his breath ruled over every poor soul who had to stand within a few feet of him. Imagine walking into court, expecting royal splendor, and instead being hit with a gust of air that smelled like a medieval garlic factory had exploded inside his mouth. Chronic halitosis haunted him, the kind born of rotting teeth and festering gums. Add to that his love of garlic, onions, and copious amounts of alcohol, and you've got a weapon of mass destruction lurking right behind his smile. Courtiers wrote that audiences with James were less about politics and more about surviving the stench without fainting. People literally angled their bodies sideways, nodding from a safe distance, pretending to be deeply respectful, when in reality they were just desperately avoiding his exhale. And the irony? James was obsessed with demon hunting, a king convinced witches and devils stalked his kingdom, yet it was his own breath that made courtiers believe in the supernatural. They didn't need spells or hexes, they just needed one royal whisper to feel cursed. James didn't need gallows or torture chambers to terrify his enemies. One conversation with him, and they were already gasping for air. Queen Elizabeth I, perfume as a weapon. Queen Elizabeth I dazzled her court with fiery speeches and glittering gowns, but if you got close enough, the illusion collapsed faster than a rotten floorboard. Beneath the silks and pearls was a woman who famously bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not, which meant most of the time, she didn't. Her skin was coated in thick white lead makeup, a poisonous paste that sealed sweat and dirt beneath its chalky surface. It wasn't beauty, it was rot wearing a crown. Her teeth, once pearly, decayed into a mottled brown grin, the product of a sugar addiction so severe that her smile looked less like royalty and more like a dental crime scene. But Elizabeth had a weapon, perfume. She drenched herself in rose water and oils, hoping to smother the stench of mildew-soaked gowns, sour sweat, and rotting gums. Courtiers swooned at her presence, though not always from admiration. Behind the legend of the Virgin Queen was a cloud of fragrance thick enough to choke a horse, hiding a smell that no perfume could truly erase. Her court praised her brilliance, her power, her beauty. But in truth, Elizabeth wasn't just ruling England, she was waging a losing war against her own odor. King Louis XIV, the Sun, King of Stench. Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, ruled from the glittering halls of Versailles. On the surface, it was the palace of dreams, mirrors that caught every flicker of candlelight, fountains gushing like liquid diamonds, gardens designed with surgical precision. But step inside, take one breath, and the fantasy collapses. Versailles stank, and at the center of it all was Louis himself. The Sun King, radiant in silk and lace, rarely touched water. He believed bathing could make him sick. Instead, he masked his flesh with layers of powder and oceans of perfume, so much perfume it could choke an ambassador before the first bow. His own body betrayed him. Sores, skin infections, and rotting teeth combined to create an aroma more foul than the overflowing chamber pots littering the palace halls. Guests described Versailles as beautiful to the eye but unbearable to the nose, a perfume factory built directly over an open sewer. And Louis? He demanded endless parties, balls, and performances, forcing nobles to twirl and laugh while drowning in clouds of sweat, urine, and cologne. The irony. This was a king obsessed with glory, obsessed with the memory of his reign. Yet what he left most unforgettable wasn't light. It was the lingering darkness of his stench. Catherine de' Medici, a walking poison cloud. Catherine de' Medici, the Italian-born Queen of France, practically turned herself into a weaponized fog. She adored perfumes so much she carried them everywhere, perfumed gloves, scented oils, incense burners that followed her through the palace. To outsiders, it looked glamorous, exotic, even enchanting, but the truth was uglier. Catherine almost never bathed, terrified that water would seep into her pores and kill her. So instead of washing, she marinated in layer after layer of oils and perfumes, trapping the sweat, dirt, and festering sores beneath. Her gowns absorbed it all, turning her into a walking compost heap disguised as royalty. Her obsession with perfumes grew so extreme that rumors spread through France. Was she hiding something worse than sweat? Some whispered she laced her concoctions with poison, slipping death beneath the pleasant floral notes. Whether or not it was true, one thing was certain: her presence was suffocating. Courtiers often described her as a toxic cloud drifting through the halls, leaving behind headaches, nausea, and suspicion. Catherine wasn't just the Queen of France, she was a chemical weapon in pearls and lace. And while she conquered politics with cunning, her greatest invention may have been proving that too much perfume doesn't erase a stench, it multiplies it. King Henry VIII, rotting Majesty. King Henry VIII is remembered for many things: his 6 wives, his temper, his appetite for power. But what his portraits don't show is the nauseating reality of standing in the same room with him during his later years. By then, Henry was monstrously obese, barely able to walk, and suffering from a festering leg ulcer that refused to heal. The wound oozed pus and blood constantly, soaking his bandages and seeping through his expensive silk stockings. Servants described the smell as unbearable, a mix of rotting meat and sewage that clung to him wherever he went. Imagine being summoned to court, only to have your king's very body make you gag before he opened his mouth. And speaking of mouths, Henry's teeth had rotted away, leaving his breath foul enough to knock courtiers back a step. Yet he still demanded grand banquets, still tore into greasy meat, still wiped his hands on his already stained robes. Nobles pretended to adore him, smiling while fighting the urge to vomit. Here was a man who executed wives and advisors without hesitation, who ruled with iron will, and yet he couldn't rule his own decay. The king who terrified a nation also terrified noses. And with every step, every whiff, Henry reminded England that sometimes the true horror of monarchy wasn't political, it was olfactory. King Philip II of Spain, a saintly stench. King Philip II of Spain believed water was the enemy of the soul. Bathing to him was sinful vanity, a distraction from prayer and piety, so he avoided it for years. His clothes rarely changed, became stained with sweat and grease, crawling with lice and fleas. His chambers reeked of mildew and incense, the sickly sweet smoke doing nothing to mask the odor rising from his body. Visitors described the smell of his presence as a punishment in itself, a stench that clung to walls, tapestries, and anyone unfortunate enough to kneel too close. His health collapsed under gout, festering wounds, and constant infections. By the end, Philip's flesh decayed while he was still alive, his body exuding the odor of a corpse rotting in summer heat. Devout followers called it holy suffering, as though his stink were proof of divine endurance. But the irony was cruel. Philip prayed endlessly for salvation, building one of the most religious courts in Europe. Yet even the relics of saints in his chapel couldn't compete with the odor leaking from their king. Holiness might have saved his soul, but his nose was already damned. Maria Theresa of Austria, the Empress of refuse. Maria Theresa of Austria may have ruled one of Europe's most powerful empires, but her personal hygiene would have made even her peasants recoil. This was a woman who bore 16 children, but apparently decided bathing was too much of a burden. Servants whispered that she often wore the same undergarments for weeks, until the fabric turned stiff with sweat and grime. Rather than wash with water, she preferred wiping herself with cloths, leaving layers of filth clinging to her skin like armor. Her gowns absorbed the odor until they reeked like damp rags pulled from a gutter. The palace itself mirrored her habits. Chamber pots overflowed behind curtains, stairwells, even in ballrooms, until the air was thick with ammonia and rot. During her pregnancies, midwives reported that her delivery rooms smelled like butcher shops left too long in the sun. Yet courtiers, gagging behind polite smiles, still hailed her as a devoted mother and formidable ruler. The irony was unbearable. A dynasty built on order and strength, presided over by a matriarch who lived like a walking refuse heap. History paints her as powerful, disciplined, and wise. But up close, Maria Theresa wasn't an empress of refinement, she was the empress of stench. So there you have it, 7 royals who ruled kingdoms, commanded armies, and shaped history, yet couldn't master the simple art of not smelling like death warmed over. They dined on golden platters, slept under silk canopies, and wore jewels worth more than villages, but their bodies reeked worse than the corpses rotting in plague pits. Perfume became their armor, incense their shield, and served their unwilling hostages in an endless battle against their own decay. History books like to paint them as glorious leaders, symbols of divine power. But peel back the portraits, and what you get is a parade of ulcers, lice, rotting teeth, and sweat-soaked gowns. Maybe that's the real joke of monarchy. No matter how high the crown sits, you can't perfume away the stink of mortality. In the end, the peasants bathing in rivers smelled cleaner than the rulers sitting on golden thrones. And centuries later, their politics are forgotten, their empires crumbled, but their odor lingers on in history's memory, putrid, unforgettable, and darkly funny. Because kings and queens may have ruled the world, but their noses never ruled themselves.